Okay, today I'm going to be going over Amos, Tutuola, and the Yoruba religion, which both of the two originate from the Yoruba region in Nigeria. But first, we're going to talk about Amos Tutuola, his early life, some about his writings, and we'll draw some conclusions for that. So, up first, we have Amos Tutuola and his early life. He was born in 1920 in Ake. It's a Yoruba region of Nigeria. It's about 50 miles from Lagos. And Lagos is a coastal city. It's the largest city in Nigeria. He spent a lot of his childhood listening to Yoruba folk tales from his mother and his aunt. And that's kind of where, well, that's probably mostly where he draws all his stories from his later years in life. But we'll get into that. Early in his life, he was sent to some primary education at Salvation Army Missionary, but unfortunately, his father, I believe, was a farmer of cocoa, and he was forced to leave due to the cost of tuition. He, in between, essentially just after that, he took up farming with his father, and then eventually found a job as a houseboy under a local government clerk. And I believe a houseboy is essentially like a servant position. But the government clerk took a shine to him and eventually paid for Amos to continue his education through high school. He completed and exited. There's not much notable in between him exiting high school and leaving his position there, but we'll continue on. In his later life, he served under Britain's Royal Air Force during World War II as a blacksmith. And then after getting out, tried to start his own business as a smithy himself, but unfortunately it did not take off. So instead of continuing to pursue a blacksmith position, he took a job as a messenger and a storage clerk for Nigeria's labor department. And he found that he had a lot of free time, and during this free time, he just started writing down the stories of his childhood. So traditional Yoruba tales, or the bush tales that he had heard passed down, all from word of mouth. Over time, he essentially had such a collection of stories that he sent it off to a publisher on a whim. And I think the original publisher received like 77 pages bound in paper, reviewed it, and approved it for publishing. And that's kind of how he started his career, as a writer at least. Of his writings, at least, I think he wrote around 9 books that were published. But the Palm Wine Drinkard, which is usually shortened to the Palm Wine Drinkard, and his Dead Palm Wine Tapster in the Dead's Town, that was his most widely received book, especially for out of country. A lot of his writings were described as bizarre, comical, kind of grisly at times. Since they're a collection of tales and they're stemming from these kind of traditional word of mouth, they don't really follow a lot of the structures that we have nowadays. Some will end abruptly, and a lot of the times they don't always have happy endings. Abroad, he received a lot of praise for essentially being like a primitive sort of literature, or being like a essentially as written, it's as is written as it would be told, essentially. But he did receive a lot of criticism amongst Nigerians in his own country, that stories were not essentially up to par. They were kind of poor examples of what Nigerian culture is, and it's a poor representation. So there's a little bit of conflict as far as in country and abroad. As far as conclusions for Amos Tutuola's life, we'll go into the Yoruba religion and we'll talk about how it kind of ties into his works there. But I think from his personal life and as far as how it ties into his writing, one of the critiques that he gets, as I stated before, is that his writings are kind of a poor representation. And one of the things that I'm drawing is that he had a fairly limited education, and all of the stories that he is retelling is probably a decade and a half later, as he writes. So there could be a disconnect there. Also, he doesn't have the prime writing tools available to him as, say, like an English writer today, um, especially in Nigeria as well. It's probably a lot more difficult. Um, and to further kind of demonstrate that, if you go and try and search up some of Nigeria's most famous writers, there's a list essentially, and Amos actually ranks around number 34. The list does change quite frequently, but the top most praised writers right now are all pretty newer writers. So within the last 50 to 60 years or so. So you can kind of see that reflected. I imagine the people voting on this are people interested in Nigerian culture and probably a good representation of the Nigerian population themselves. So you can kind of see where he falls popularity-wise there. But after that, up next we have the Yoruba religion. So the Yoruba religion is very unique. It was developed amongst this kind of ethnic group in Nigeria and Benin. They call themselves the Yoruba people. But its primary belief is that before anyone is born, you stand before Oludumare, and I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation, but essentially God, and you choose your own destiny. So all of your life accomplishments, all the world contributions, your death, your children, your spouse or multiple spouses, but all of that is essentially decided before you arrive on Earth. Olodumare themselves is kind of described. It's kind of not described really. They don't really have a gender, and it's kind of like a larger concept. They live in the sky, and they're very distant from their worshippers. Instead of directly communicating with their worshippers, they do most of their contact through orishas, and orishas act as it's called an intercessor, but essentially means of communication between the divine and humanity. But orishas are kind of akin to angels in our regular Judeo-Christian sort of life, but all orishas live on Earth, essentially. Some of them have been present since the beginning of time. Some of them were raised up from normal people who led extraordinary lives. One of the most notable features of orishas that is mentioned is that they're just extremely human. They'll marry, they'll divorce, they eat, they drink, they have personal tastes, all sorts of very human things, and it just makes them very relatable to the common person. Since they all live on Earth, they typically live in aspects of the planet themselves, so you're not going to see an orisha walking around, essentially, typically, or you wouldn't know it. People who follow the Yoruba religion will essentially perform these sort of elaborate dance rituals and try to invoke orishas to essentially possess their bodies. And there are different orishas. There are some main orishas, like the spirit of the sky, or the spirit of the water, or the spirit of the mountain, and they can try to invoke particular orishas for particular needs, using essentially pre-chosen or traditional dances that are associated only with that particular orisha. But here we have a depiction of a dance that would summon an orisha, and here we have a depiction of seven of the orishas, but I assume essentially they're some of the most common orishas. And then, as far as other key beliefs go, Yoruba has sort of a high-level idea of a force called ash, and it's kind of like chi or chakra in Chinese or Indian belief. It's kind of like this life force that inhabits everything, divine, human, sentient and non-sentient. So it could be, it's really neither good or bad. It's kind of just an energy, and what comes out of it or what happens due to it uh, is everything on Earth. So it can range from lightning, thunder. It's in blood. It's in names. Um, the Orishas are filled with it. Humans are filled with it. It essentially inhabits everything in the world. As far as goals go, um, one of the most interesting things to me that I found, at least, is that the goal for the Yoruba religion isn't salvation itself. Since I think that kind of ties into the whole your destiny has already been chosen. So all the actions that you are going to take, you're going to take no matter what. So the idea, or one of the major ideas, is that you should live the greatest life you can right now. And it kind of conflicts a little bit, because you would think that if you're living your greatest life, that was already predetermined, and if you're living a crappy life, that was also always that was also predetermined. But I think it's just kind of one of those will or won't sort of things. Another major belief is that a lot of the dead reincarnate into new people, essentially. And one of the big goals and hopes is to be reincarnated into your own family again. You'll see a lot of older generations, after they pass, their grandchildren or great grandchildren will be named after the grandparents because of familiar features, or just as a kind of continuation, because they see some of the old person in them, and it can kind of be seen as, oh well, great grandpa died, but now he is now in the new child. Lastly, Yoruba kind of has like a certain elasticity to it. It's very flexible, since it's kind of I mean, they're not seeking salvation, and all of their goals are predetermined, so everything that happens in your life is predetermined. So when they have adopted quite a few things, like um, uh, essentially, if they find something that's agreeable to their beliefs, they'll incorporate them and they'll integrate them into their own religion. A lot of the tenets of Yoruba religion kind of varies depending on who you talk to, depending on what they have indoctrinated themselves. There can be a lot of variation and flexibility, which I find very interesting. But those are kind of the key components. As far as conclusions go, as far as drawing into Amos Tutuola's life, I can definitely see how the Yoruba religion kind of plays a big part. It he If he follows the path that everything that in his life is predetermined, as he jots down his writings, I can think that after he's compiling so much, the next logical step is to get it submitted and have it published. So it was kind of like a predetermined fate, I would think, for him submitting those stories. But those are kind of the key points of Yoruba. That's a brief introduction to Amos Tutuola's life, some of his inspirations, kind of a little bit about his writings. But that is all I got. Thank you.